Top 10 laws from the Middle Ages we're still breaking today. Let's take a mind-bending trip back to the Middle Ages where laws were as strict as they were medieval. I made you with most amazing, and these are the top 10 laws from the Middle Ages we are still breaking today. Coming in at number 10, we have a law that forbade begging without a license. Yeah, you heard me right. Begging was apparently so regulated back then that you needed an actual license to ask for spare change. It's like a medieval version of busking, but instead of a guitar and a bowl, you just had a bowl and a license. Now, while we might not be flaunting beggar licenses these days, the echoes of this law can still be heard. Consider those street performers who still need permits to entertain the masses, or those panhandlers who sometimes find themselves in legal predicaments. The idea of needing permission to ask for help seems to have somehow persisted. If you're enjoying the video so far, you can support this channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 9, no speaking ill of pigeons. This one here reminds me of that movie The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. And if you haven't guessed why, it's because, well, you clearly haven't seen the movie and absolutely need to. It basically sums up why this law was a thing. See, while not quite medieval, but close enough, sailors across the globe came up with an unwritten yet solemnly followed law which forbade directing any negative energy whatsoever towards pigeons, whether that be hunting them down for a desperate meal or simply bad-mouthing the birds because one of them dropped a hot dookie on your new pirate boots. Now, the reasoning behind this law came from more of a superstition than anything else. See, sailors at the time believed that pigeons were the reincarnated souls of men who'd lost their lives at sea, and so to disrespect these birds was not only a sign of bad faith towards the dearly departed, but was also thought to be the source of bad omens for crew with little respect for the sea. At number 8, thou shalt not bloweth thy nose. Let's gallop over to Newmarket, a quaint little town in Suffolk, England, where the birth of horse racing was celebrated as a knight's triumphant return. You see, way back in the 12th century, they were onto something big, what would now today be known as horse racing. But it wasn't until the 17th century, thanks to James I and his swanky palace, that this racing phenomenon truly took off. It seems that amidst the equine excitement, authorities in Newmarket had some quirky concerns. To keep those prized horses in tip-top shape, they passed a law that forbade the blowing of noses in streets. That's right, my friends, the medieval streets were to remain snot-free zones to prevent equine ailments. Imagine suffering from hay fever or a head cold and having to stifle those sniffles, all in the name of horse health. Oh, the sacrifices one must take for the sake of the racetrack. But that wasn't the only hurdle, pun intended, that the Newmarket residents had to leap over. If you happened to be strutting around in town with a cold or a feverish temperature, you weren't just facing tissues and soup, you were facing a fine. That's right, it seems medieval authorities took horse racing seriously. Blowing your nose and braving illness could quite literally cost you a pretty penny. At number 7, no tennis or football. Imagine a time when football wasn't about fancy jerseys or perfectly timed dives, but it was about as brutal as it could get. Medieval football, folks, was more like a full contact battlefield than a sporting event. Picture this, instead of a nice cushy ball, they used an inflated pig's bladder. And the field? Well, it wasn't some well-defined rectangular patch, oh no. Villagers played football by kicking that piggy bladder across entire stretches of land, with goals sometimes miles apart. Now, players didn't just use their feet, they used their fists and feet both on the bladder and each other. Now you'd think twice before complaining about a modern day foul, huh? Fast forward to the 14th century and we meet Edward III, who decided to put an end to this chaotic spectacle. Not out of concern for the player's well-being, mind you, but because he was more into national security. You see, in 1349, England was juggling two things, a battle with France and the devastating Black Plague. With a dwindling number of healthy men, Edward III wanted his folks to be practicing archery for national defense rather than risking limbs in a pig bladder-infused brawl. The punishment for football hooligans? A not-so-cozy 6-day imprisonment. But it's not just football that had a run-in with medieval law. Tennis, the sport that gave us those elegant rallies today, had a rather humble and illegal beginning in the Middle Ages. In 1485, non-noble young men playing tennis were illegal, except for a Christmas Day free pass. The reasoning was that it wasn't about keeping them from having fun, it was because medieval tennis was seen as a disruptor of labor and a generator of gambling among the commoners. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Now the ban on non-nobles playing tennis had an ulterior motive, maintaining the good old feudal hierarchy. Tennis also demanded pricey gear and a grasp of fancy rules and social decorum, and so tennis found itself in the hands of the elite. Number 6 is no smashing on Sundays. Or Thursdays, or Fridays. That's right, authorities even governed when you were allowed to get busy in the bedroom. Picture this, a medieval married couple, all eager to embrace some romance, but hold up, they're checking the calendar. And it turns out in those times, you couldn't just hop into bed whenever you pleased. Nope, you had to consider the holy days, which are kind of like the VIP days for prayer and religious observance. So rule number 1, no smashing on certain days of the week. Here's the scoop. Out of your 7-day week, the Middle Ages allowed you to indulge in romance just 4 out of those days. So no lovey-dovey time on Thursdays, Fridays, or Sundays, because Thursdays and Fridays were all about prepping for Holy Communion, and Sundays, now if you're thinking, okay, that's a bit of a downer, but manageable, just wait. It wasn't just weekly restrictions. We're talking about Lent, which was also quite the extended abstinence period, between 47 and 62 days to be precise. Think of it as a time to give up more than just chocolate. I remember the 35 days leading up to Christmas? Yeah, no merrymaking of a particular kind during that countdown. But it doesn't stop there. There's also the Feast of the Pentecost, with its variable 40 to 60 day embargo on romance. And on top of that, medieval folks believed that eye contact was like a secret weapon of attraction. According to them, eyes weren't just passively taking in the view, no, they were emitting some sort of desire-inducing energy, so they, of course, warned women not to cast their seductive glances at the wrong time lest they tempt the gentleman too soon. At number 5, no blasphemy. Imagine you're living in a time when uttering a few ill-advised words could cost you your voice quite literally. Yes, literally, not as in I'm getting shadow banned on the internet, more like you'll never utter an intelligible sentence again. The concept of blasphemy had tongues wagging, or rather not wagging at all. Blasphemy wasn't just a casual faux pas, it was like playing with fire, except the fire was a red-hot pair of pliers. You see, back in the day, the medieval Catholic Church held the reins of power, and they weren't too keen on anyone dissing the divine. Blasphemy, the act of bad-mouthing God or anything sacred, was their big no-no. This wasn't just about keeping things civil, it was about maintaining order, control, and of course, keeping the flock in line. At number 4 is forbidden footwear. 15th century Britain wasn't just about knights and castles, it was also a time of fashion statements that, let's be honest, would turn heads even today. Now picture this, short skirts and long, pointy-ended toes known as krakows. Now these weren't just shoes, they were statements. The longer the toe, the more masculine and wealthy you were considered. Some shoes even stretched out to a jaw-dropping 5 inches beyond the toes. Oh yes, and occasionally people had to tie those extended ends around their ankles. Now, as much as these fashionable folks thought they were nailing it, the English crown wasn't too thrilled. You see, peasants were suddenly getting in on the extravagant clothing action, and suddenly everyone was starting to look a bit too high class. The crown, being all about preserving the social order, had to put its foot down literally. Between the years 1463 and 1604, they dropped the hammer, or rather the shoe, on this whole Krakow madness. They passed a law that essentially said, hey, no knight below the rank of lord, esquire, or gentleman, and definitely no regular person can rock these shoes. No more excessive toes for you. If you dare defy this decree, well, your wallet is going to feel it. A fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence was the price of that over-the-top footwear rebellion, and just to put that into perspective, that's like $136 in today's currency. At number 3, no 3-course meals. 2 courses max. The Middle Ages, a time of knights, castles, and apparently some rather curious eating habits. Back in the year 1336, they had what you might call the OG version of portion control. It wasn't just about staying fit and fabulous, it was more about social hierarchy and keeping the, well, not so Joneses. You see, sumptuary laws were all the rage, regulations that dictated whether or not you could consume, because heaven forbid common folk start imitating the feasting habits of their overlords. One particular law in the sumptuary playbook was a gastronomical game changer, the 2-course wonder. No matter your station in life, be you a humble serf or a lord with lands, you were limited to a measly 2 courses for your meal. And just to make sure there were no loopholes, they had to spell that out as yes, soup indeed counted as its own course. And of course, just like any good old rule, there were always exceptions. The feast of all feasts, Christmas, had the green light for 3 courses. 'Tis the season to be jolly after all, and apparently being jolly requires an extra helping. But why the obsession with culinary constraints? Well, it was all about keeping the classes in check. The higher-ups didn't want to have the underlings getting any fancy ideas about living the lavish life. At number 2, no witchcraft. One such peculiar law was the ban on practicing witchcraft, driven by lack of scientific understanding. In an era where thunderstorms and bad harvests baffled minds, blaming witches was apparently the most logical thing to do. Yet these supported conjurers were often just elderly women with cats. The Witchcraft Act of 1542 took this fear to new heights, making witchcraft punishable by This triggered a frenzy of witch hunting, leading to over 500 executions between the 15th and 18th centuries. It's a reminder of how fear and ignorance can twist reality. And while we've left witch hunts behind, let's not forget the importance of seeking true knowledge over superstition. At number 1, the Ordeals of Crime. Medieval England wove a peculiar justice tapestry. The upper class, fearing commoners, had a draconian approach to power. Minor offenses led to cruel cascades of consequences, and until 1215, accusations weren't mere pointers, but keys to the ordeals. the consequences that you would get if you committed any of the above crimes. The first is the ordeal by fire. You have to hold a red hot iron bar, and if you heal, congrats, but if that thing doesn't heal, then you're treated as guilty. Next we have the water ordeal. If you sink, you're innocent, but if you float, well, the river's rejection had to mean that you were guilty. And lastly, we have the ordeal by combat. If you're strong, you're apparently favored by God in this medieval wrestling match. It's high stakes and low hygiene, which often ended in swords and silence. Behold your meed, because in 1215, the Pope finally declared an end to the ordeals. And as always, if there's a medieval law you think I've missed, feel free to let me know down in the comments. This has been AJ with Most Amazing, and I'll catch you in another video. Peace out.